Okay, so we have consequences for correct responses or incorrect responses, right? So we've got our things that are completely laid out on the table, our things that go into setting up and prep. Then we deliver our prompt or direction. Then we have our response from the learner, and then we need to respond somehow depending on whether it was a correct or incorrect response with a different response. Okay? So, correct responses receive positive reinforcement, which may be in the form of verbal praise and or through a token economy or delivery of some sort of tangible primary reinforcer like a sweet. Okay? The type of and amount of reinforcement must also be defined and adhered to, as it can be an integral part of the success of the educational program. Again, so that'll probably go into your antecedent piece here. You already have those things set up because you know what your learner has as part of their programming and as part of their reward system to encourage motivation to engage in these materials. Remember, we talked about establishing operations. So that's a big part of that. For the sake of this training, we'll say that reinforcement will be delivered after every single correct response. So every time Jane points to the correct colored card, positive reinforcement through tokens is immediately delivered, okay? So giving reinforcement after every correct response is called a continuous schedule of reinforcement, or it could also be defined as a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, with the one denoting how many correct responses are necessary to provide reinforcement. So for example, and I think we touched upon this in our reinforcement area, but we'll follow through with a little bit more now. If I was going to make sure that our learner got reinforcement for every single correct response, that would be a 1-to-1 ratio. If I wanted to say, and remember that's continuous reinforcement, right? But if I did a fixed ratio, which is FR, a fixed ratio could also be something like 1-to-2. Okay? So for every 2 correct responses, they get a token or an edible. Or it could be anything like 1 token or edible for every 5, or 1 for every 10. Okay? It depends on the ability for your learner to wait or have delayed reinforcement. Okay? Remember, one of those keys to reinforcement and consequences is immediacy, right? And the more novel a program, and also for some children that just may need a higher level of reinforcement, the more dense of a schedule that needs to be, okay? Whereas if they've gotten in the habit of doing a program for a while, you might be able to thin out that reinforcement, okay? Or maybe they've completed quite a bit of it and you can start to withdraw. So that's where you get your fixed ratio. You can also do something called a variable ratio. So a variable ratio means that around every so many responses you deliver reinforcement, okay? So a variable ratio could still be around maybe every 1-to-5. So not always 5, maybe on the 4th time you give them a reward, or on the 6th or 7th time you give them a reward, but on average it's around that 5th. Or you could do the same again, that 1-to-10. So around every 10th time. Maybe sometimes it's the 8th time they get something correct, or maybe the 13th time that they get something correct, but on average it's around that 1-to-10. Research shows that variable reinforcement is actually more productive and motivating over time than fixed ratio. I want you to think of the example of someone gambling, okay? You're at the casino. You get a payout on a fixed schedule. Every 5 times, I know that this machine is going to pay out, okay? So either A, you're going to be that person that walks around the casino looking at all of the machines to see if it's on the 4th time, because that 5th time, you're going to be on it to get that payout, right? Or you're going to sit on a machine and hold it down and just keep playing, keep playing, keep playing, until all of a sudden it stops paying out on the 5th time. You might play it a few more times, but then when it doesn't on that 5th time, you're going to be like, oh my God, this thing's broken. I'm moving on to something else, right? Whereas, if you had a variable ratio, like they currently employ at casinos, where it keeps you guessing, you're going to be more likely to keep playing because you never know when it will not pay out. It's the same idea with programming and getting students to engage and motivate them in learning. They're not 100% sure. They can't count on exactly when you're going to provide them with reinforcement, so they're more likely to maintain their momentum over time. All right? So that's why variable schedules are always more preferred when we're working with students. Okay? Other types of schedules of reinforcement, we have interval reinforcement. So the same thing though, instead of ratio, we would have fixed interval, FI, and variable interval. So now this isn't the number of responses, okay, but this is the amount of time that goes by. So around every, we could say 1 to every 5 minutes, okay, or 1 to every 30 seconds. And this will go over a little bit more when we get to our interval data collection sheets and our duration data collection sheets. But this really is more for behavioral responding, increasing and decreasing behavior, because every 5 minutes that goes by, as soon as it's 1 second over that 5 minute, you provide reinforcement contingent on what the behavior is that we're looking for, okay? Or maybe it's 30 seconds, right? But you could also write this as, there's quite a few different ways that we'll get into this in further detail in future trainings. But just so you get an idea of that there is also interval reinforcement that goes on, okay? And variable interval, again, it's the same thing, but it's like around that 5 minute mark, or around that 30-second mark, okay? So you could say maybe like around every 30 seconds that my individual isn't engaged in aggressive behavior, I provide a token, maintaining their positive behavioral momentum over time, okay? But as soon as they engage in negative behavior, then you delay providing reinforcement. Okay. So let's come back up here to our consequences, positive or negative. All right. So where were we? I'm trying to think here. Let's do the number 4. We've got our positive consequence plus or consequence minus. So correct response, exactly what our consequence would be, and an incorrect response, exactly what our consequence would be. So we talked a little bit about correct responding for, or what we would do for correct responding, right? Giving reinforcement on either a continuous schedule or an intermittent schedule that we have down here. So we could say continuous or intermittent. We'll say for our purposes here, it's going to be continuous for Jane. So in a 1-to-1 schedule. So every correct response, she gets a token. okay? And so we'll have to add up here tokens to our antecedent, okay? If she gets an incorrect response on here, we have to follow through with an error correction procedure. So let's talk about incorrect responding. So an error correction procedure, there used to be a train of thought where we would respond with a teacher providing a no, looking away, removing teaching materials, and that being the signal that that was an incorrect response. But research showed that this actually isn't best practice, and this really isn't achieving anything, because you're dealing with individuals that have unusual motivation, and for them to see you do that no had absolutely no effect on them at all, and it was just a waste of time, and if anything, probably confusing for them about your verbal expression. Like, is that a direction, or are you like giving me a consequence? I don't understand, right? So instead, a correction procedure would be followed by the teacher to show the child what the correct response was, okay? Or what our error correction procedure is. This correction would use a pre-chosen prompt to guide the child and help them understand what the correct response was. When written out, the correction is generally abbreviated with a CORR in apostrophes, or a C2 if there's a second level to the error correction procedure. As an example, if the teacher said point to red, but Jane pointed to the blue card, the teacher might then point a full gestural prompt, right, to the red card saying red. Then the teacher would then give a neutral statement and say, let's try another one, or let's do it again. For incorrect responses, no reinforcement is given, and any words that you give to tell them if they did or didn't do something is generally just neutral, okay? You're not over the top, like, good job! Instead, it's just, nope, this is the red one, okay? And then you move forward. One thing to note, though, when I typically do an error correction procedure, I'll put in something that you provide the prompt again, and then you follow through immediately with doing the error correction procedure, showing them the correct response, and then neutrally saying something like, that's the blue card, good. And then switching up with another program, maybe you ask them to do a compliance that you already know is in their repertoire, so that you can give them some sort of verbal praise, like, yeah, that's clapping your hands, good job, right? You're maintaining that behavioral momentum, and then you might be able to ask them the question again, or move on to a different program. But for our case here, we would do continuous reinforcement for a positive for a positive consequence, and then for negative, we're going to say error correction procedure. Okay, so let's look back in our example here from match pictures to objects. So if we read through this, it tells you exactly what our error correction procedure should be for the negative response. So if student does not move picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, say match, that would be your reprompt, while modeling the matching movement. Wait 5 seconds for a response. If student moves the picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, praise and provide reinforcer. If student does not move picture so that it makes contact with the corresponding object, say match again. So this would be your error correction number 2, C2. You reprompt it a second time, match, and use physical guidance to help student move the picture to the corresponding object. Okay, and then it tells you exactly how you should score that. So